It's a real thrill to be here this morning. My wife and I escaped a big snowstorm in Vermont in order to get down here, and we've just had a great time with the folks who have hosted us the past 24 hours, including Gary. Gary, thank you for that introduction. I also want to thank Penny Nixon for your congregation's wonderful hosting of this event. We had the opportunity to have dinner together last night, and it was like we were sister and brother from different mother or something like that. It was. Oh, is that better? Yeah. Okay. Good. I usually have such a big voice that I overwhelm the mics. As Gary said, I'm special advisor on climate justice to the General Minister and President, the head of the United Church of Christ, John Dorhauer. And my book, this book was by no means a guaranteed big deal. Publishers were really reluctant to publish it back in 2016, 2017. But finally, when Trump pulled us out of the Paris Climate Accord and our denomination, the UCC, opposed that to the tune of 97% of the delegates voting a resolution that I wrote, that became a headline on the Boston Globe, and that convinced the publisher to go ahead and publish that book. So, thank God that sometimes things work out in that regard. If you want to know more about me and what I'm up to, I have a website, jimantal.com. And the last thing I want to say on an introductory basis is that I come from a family of scientists, and probably I should have been one of them, but I made kind of a turn and became a religion guy instead. But my dad, full confession, was the head chemical engineer for ExxonMobil. So when that's fine, bring it on. When I was 8 years old in 1958, we were talking about tar sands in Canada as being completely uneconomical to extract oil from, because my dad was a chemical engineer, not a mechanical engineer. And it wasn't until the mid-'80s that the mechanical engineers figured out horizontal drilling. And that's what creates the possibility for fracking, and that's what allows, as we are now, the United States to become the biggest oil and gas producer in the world. So I bring that background, that science-y background to this in a way without apology. But let me begin by just saying a few words about the situation God has called us to, a world in which climate change is not some future event. Climate change, as all of you know, is happening now. In Australia, well over 1 billion animals have been killed by these unprecedented wildfires. And what wasn't reported widely was that these wildfires all occurred before fire season began. Drought is now measured in decades, not in years. Rainfall from big storms is now measured in feet, not in inches. Since 1950, the number of floods across the world has increased by 15 times, extreme temperature events by 20 times, and wildfires by at least 7-fold. The temperatures would be a lot hotter were it not for the oceans. Oceans absorb about 91% of the heat created by global warming, and we now know that the oceans are warming at a rate 40% faster than we thought. As they absorb CO2, the oceans are becoming more acidic at a rate in excess of any change the world has seen in 300 million years. On a larger scale, the Earth's temperature is already well into the range that existed during the Eemian period 120,000 years ago, when sea level rise was between 20 and 30 feet higher than it is today. And 2 days ago, the temperature in Antarctica hit 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Finally, there are about 10 million plant and animal species in the world, and today 1 million of them are at risk of extinction. So truly, we are living in an unprecedented emergency. Now I want to name 5 broad ethical concerns that will help you to understand why people of faith must engage the challenge of climate change. Many fail to understand the first broad ethical concern, that climate change is an injustice multiplier and accelerator. Let me spell that out for you. Climate change multiplies and accelerates injustice in at least 3 ways. First, the first injustice is that climate change is hitting the poorest people first and worst. It's the poorest people and people of color who live in areas that are most likely to flood, most prone to disease, most subject to droughts, heat waves, and various diseases that are now migrating as a consequence of climate change. And here in America, our inner cities have a health crisis that gets worse each summer. As temperatures rise, more and more cases of asthma are disabling and killing children and elderly people of color. On Ash Wednesday, the National United Church of Christ, that's in a couple of weeks, the National United Church of Christ will be releasing a new report detailing this connection. And whether or not you're connected with my denomination, this will become, I think, for at least one news cycle, something of national attention worth looking into. The second injustice is that those most affected by climate change did nothing to cause it, and they are powerless to stop it. For example, the farmers in parts of Africa who are losing their lands either to drought or to unprecedented flooding, they have a carbon footprint 1/200th the carbon footprint of the average American. And the third injustice that people and institutions who actually caused and are causing climate change, they aren't paying for the reparations or the catastrophic damage that they have caused. Not only that, here in the United States, we actually subsidize fossil fuel companies to the tune of $25 billion a year. I'll have more to say about that in a minute. So whatever the justice issues that concern you or your congregation most, climate change is making those justice issues worse. That's why we can't regard climate change as just one of the many justice issues. We care about climate change as both an injustice multiplier and an injustice accelerator. The second broad ethical concern associated with climate change is humanity's inadequate focus on and acceptance of intergenerational responsibility. I'll have more to say about that in a moment. The third broad ethical concern associated with climate change focuses on our relationship and our attitude toward nature. With the exception of indigenous cultures, humanity regards nature as a treasure trove for exploitation. As Ta-Nehisi Coates points out in his book, Between the World and Me, over the past few centuries, we have enslaved the earth. Over the past 200 years, we have built the modern world by exploiting resources nature took 150 million years to create. This is no different than our exploitation of black bodies over the past many centuries. To me, it is unthinkable that the major religions of the world have developed over the past several thousand years in a way that seems to be okay with the notion of owning nature. If you're interested, I'd be more than glad to talk about this more during Q&A. A fourth broad ethical concern raised by climate change is the need for a new understanding of fiduciary accountability. Let's not forget that as people of faith, it's our forebears in the faith who introduced the notion of fiduciary. The word means to keep faith. The current understanding of fiduciary allows directors of companies to claim the moral and legal high ground when all they do is maximize their short-term monetary profit for their shareholders. For centuries, the church has ceded to the legal and investment world the exclusive right to interpret society's understanding of fiduciary responsibility. I believe it's both crazy and criminal to think that an investment advisor has satisfied his or her fiduciary responsibility by assuring maximum financial profit over the next quarter while ignoring the fact that the investment will end up wrecking the home of the investor. I'm not alone in this view. As I discuss in my book, former Securities and Exchange Commissioner Beavis Longstreet, who gets the award for the best name that's going to be said today, right? Beavis Longstreet. He's in agreement with me. If you're interested, again, we can discuss this further during Q&A. A fifth broad ethical concern is the short-term time horizon that dominates both investment practices as well as political agendas. Humanity needs to follow moral principles that take seriously the fact that for the past many decades, we have acted in ways that have consequences for centuries and probably eons to come. So now I want to focus for a few minutes on vocation. In a time such as this, I'm taking that phrase from the 4th chapter of the book of Esther in Hebrew Scriptures. In a time such as this, what is your personal calling? What is the vocation of your faith community? Does humanity itself have a vocation? From my point of view, the challenge before us compels all of us to go to a deep place. Everywhere I speak, I find people longing to hear the candid, unalloyed truth, especially in response to their two most frequent questions. What can I do? What can one person do about climate change? And the second question, what can our congregation do that would make any difference? As it turns out, we've been born at a time when the continuity of creation is coming undone. We're living on the hinge of history. We're the first generation to foresee and the final generation with an opportunity to forestall the worst consequences of climate change. So as we begin to reconsider vocation in a time of climate crisis, as we attend to God's call to live into a new story, what are the qualities we need to nurture and develop? Courage is the first quality. Courage is no longer optional. Courage is required. Serving as a denominational leader in a time of profound systemic injustice and increasing discontinuity, I'm convinced that God is calling all people of faith to speak with a clear, bold, truthful, and prophetic voice in this time of climate crisis. Urgency is the second quality, and no one communicates the urgency of the climate crisis better than 17-year-old Greta Thunberg. She's been focused on climate change since she was 8. In August 2018, she embraced a new vocation. Frame it that way. She's a kid in high school, and she embraces a new vocation. She initiated a school strike for climate. First, it was only her in front of Sweden's parliament every Friday. A few months later, tens of thousands of students across all of Europe joined her. Last month, for the second year in a row, she spoke to the richest people in the world as they gathered in Davos, Switzerland. Here's what Time magazine's Person of the Year, Greta Thunberg, told them. We must change almost everything in our current societies. The bigger your carbon footprint, the bigger your moral duty. The bigger your platform, the bigger your responsibility. I don't want your hope. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day, and then I want you to act as if you were in a crisis. I want you to act as if your house were on fire, because it is. Her unrelenting focus and undiluted truthfulness has inspired millions. On September 18th, she offered the House Ways and Means Committee, the most powerful committee in Congress, her I Have a Dream speech. Imagine being a 16-year-old coming from a different country to America and having the moxie to offer an I Have a Dream speech, okay? Listen up. I have a dream that people in power, as well as the media, start treating this crisis like the existential emergency it is. In fact, I have many dreams, but this is 2019. This is not a time and place for dreams. This is time to wake up. And yet wherever I go, I seem to be surrounded by fairy tales. Elected officials make up bedtime stories to soothe us, that make us go back to sleep. The problem is we need to wake up. It's time to face the reality, the facts, and the science. This is, above all, an emergency. And not just any emergency, this is the biggest crisis humanity ever faced, and we need to act accordingly. 2 weeks later, she told the leaders of the world at the UN General Assembly, "You have stolen my dreams and my childhood by your empty words. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of economic growth. How dare you? How dare you pretend that this can be solved with just business as usual and some technical solutions?" But the young people are beginning to understand your betrayal. The eyes of all future generations are upon you. And if you choose to fail us, I say we will never forgive you. We will not let you get away with this. Right here, right now, this is where we draw the line. The world is waking up and change is coming whether you like it or not. The challenge of climate change is no less urgent than when the world was faced with fascism. And so it may be helpful to be reminded of something from that era. Imagine it's 1939, and imagine FDR goes to Edsel Ford and says to Edsel Ford, "Edsel, listen, I want you to do something for me. Would you build the biggest manufacturing complex the world has ever seen? And could you finish it in 6 months? And could you manufacture in that something you've never made before? Something, I don't know, with maybe over 1 million parts? And turn out one of those things every 24 hours? Edsel, do you think you could do that for me?" If FDR had said that to Edsel Ford in 1939, Edsel Ford would have said, "Mr. President, you are out of your mind." But when FDR said it to Edsel Ford in 1941, everything had changed. And 6 months later, the Willow Run manufacturing complex was completed, and it was churning out a B-24 Liberation bomber every 24 hours. And that bomber had 1.2 million parts. So if the alarm of World War II can prompt the largest industry in America to willingly and urgently redirect its resources and change its business plan, then it's up to our generation to muster the courage that climate change requires of us to create a new story. A story so powerful that we hasten the day when each human heart is governed not by grief, but by hope, not by constraint, but by generosity, not by selfishness, but by sharing. So if courage and urgency are the first two qualities we embrace, the third quality is scale. The scale of the challenge today is enormous, and so are the solutions that are available today. The Green New Deal demonstrates all of these qualities: courage, urgency, and scale. It does so by creating abundant clean energy jobs along with a more just economy. That's why last June, the United Church of Christ and the Unitarian General Assembly both endorsed the Green New Deal. And let's remember why a future without fossil fuel is even possible. God's great gift of creation, what I like to call the original Green New Deal, offers clean, renewable energy at an almost unimaginable scale. The science is this: if we simply established an area the size of Spain, full of photovoltaic cells to absorb the sunlight while the sun was up, we would generate enough electricity for the entire world's needs. That's all it takes. So keeping in mind these qualities of courage, urgency, and scale, let me suggest several themes that the new story, God is calling us to create, several new themes of this story as we, each of us, and our congregations embrace a new vocation. The first theme is to make our houses of worship safe enough and relevant enough that we can do three things. First, we can talk about climate change. Second, that we can hear each other's testimony. What if we added a monthly 2-minute testimony to our worship services in which a member of the church who is pregnant or that person's partner would share a brief response to this question? In a world with a threatened future, what does it mean that we can bear and raise children? What if churches were safe enough that we could engage that kind of depth? The third thing we need to do is we need to process our grief. And by doing so, we will empower one another to take action as we engage the long emergency. In a time such as this, we must acknowledge that the continuity of creation, upon which thousands of generations of humans have sought moral progress, that continuity is over. And one thing more, we must recognize that the existential dread we experience, that can serve as a precondition for hope. Once we have a safe context in which we can share our dread with trusted friends, by the grace of God, the Holy Spirit will ignite in us a tenacious and defiant hope. The next two themes emerge from the 2017 UCC Synod resolution that I wrote. Pastors need to preach on climate change. And we'll talk more about that with the panel up here, but most of you are members of congregations. I don't know how much you're beating that drum with your pastor, but I want to urge you to do so. And then the next theme is that we need to resist all new fossil fuel infrastructure. In an important and helpful way to understand this is to recognize that we need to take action on both the supply side of the climate crisis and the demand side. You'll notice that the two large breakouts after we finish in plenary focus on supply side and demand side. And I know some of you are a little confused about that, so I'm going to explain that now. All of you are making demand side changes in your lives. You're recycling, you're changing your lights to LEDs, you're composting, you're turning down the heat and air conditioning. Some of you are flying less. What about trading in your car for an electric bike? Some of you are thinking about that. But as for the supply side, one supply side action would be to join with others to block any proposed new fossil fuel infrastructure. You may have heard, this was announced 3 days ago, that Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York City, signed an executive order, and never again will a building be built in New York City which is heated by fossil fuel. How about that? And I may say that's just one action that as mayor of New York City he had the power to do, and it's a whole lot better than running for president. But that's a different gathering, right? That's a different gathering. So all over the country, there are people using their expertise and their connections and their bodies to prevent unnecessary pipelines, compressor stations, and LNG terminals from being built. They're also accelerating the shutdown of coal power plants. To date, over 300 coal power plants have been shut down. So if you're interested in looking into more of the supply side activism associated with the climate movement, one of the three breakout sessions is devoted to that. The newest theme in the climate justice movement is this: we need to stop the money pipeline that continues to fund the building of new fossil fuel infrastructure. As Bill McKibben says, money is the oxygen on which the fire of the climate crisis burns. On April 23rd, mark your calendar, on April 23rd, you'll have an opportunity to join with thousands of others who will be protesting at each of the 5,200 Chase Bank branches across the country. Since 2016, J.P. Morgan Chase has lent $196 billion to fossil fuel companies. If you have a Chase credit card, join Jane Fonda. Make a video for Jamie Dimon, the CEO of Chase. Tell him in your video that if Chase doesn't end their support for fossil fuel corporations by Earth Day, then you're going to cut your Chase credit card and move your money from Chase Bank. Thousands, tens of thousands of such videos appearing and being posted over the next month could make profound changes in the funds available for new fossil fuel infrastructure. And after you've done all that, call your senator or congressperson and ask them how much of their campaign contributions come from fossil fuel corporations. And tell them that you're part of a campaign to remind voters that each year taxpayers subsidize fossil fuel corporations to the tune of $25 billion a year. Tell them they won't have your vote unless Congress passes a law to end subsidies to death-dealing fossil fuel corporations and instead subsidize green technologies like wind and solar. So here's a fifth theme. For years, I've said at hundreds of pulpits that we need to make civil disobedience a normative expression of Christian discipleship, every bit as much as prayer. For thousands of years, faith communities have encouraged their members to express their conscience on important public issues. For thousands of years, nonviolent civil disobedience has been one expression of faithfulness to religious values when those values come into conflict with the laws of the land. Many Christians are not aware that after Jesus' death, Peter and Paul spent more time in jail than out of jail between the time Jesus died and the time they died. And the reason they did that was because they were acting in service of the church that was waiting to be born, of which many of us are the beneficiaries. So it's time for faith communities to affirm their role in supporting those called by their conscience to engage in nonviolent civil disobedience. Let me put it another way. It's time for people of faith to tell the truth about how industrial civilization is ending nature as humanity exercises our hubris. It's time for people of faith to testify to an understanding of God that is not undone by our undoing of God's creation. Among other things, such testimony will certainly create the conditions for civil disobedience to become a normative expression of Christian faithfulness. Here's a sixth theme of the news story that God is calling us to create as we embrace a new vocation. I'm encouraging congregations to become Acts 2:42 congregations by valuing the common good above personal economic benefit. A first step is to undertake new behaviors in the following areas and understand your new behavior as a spiritual discipline. For example, new behaviors in shopping or in eating, driving, sharing, spending, flying, using energy, recycling, and more. Consider providing rides for one another, finding each other jobs, sharing each other's car or lawnmower, helping each other conserve. These can all be manifestations of this, of manifesting what the book of Acts in chapter 2, verse 42 suggests is that we are to live for the common good. Here's a seventh theme. Reevaluate the land on which your house of worship stands. Most congregations recognize that the people are the main kind of mission instrument of the congregation. And soon after that, they say, and the building would be the next main manifestation of mission of their congregation. But what about the land? We had several congregations in Massachusetts who began doing permaculture gardens on the land that they had. They converted their grass to permaculture gardens. And as a consequence, many of the folks interested in organic gardening who would never darken the door of a church started coming to kind of share in the gardening aspect. And many of those people then began attending church. And some powerful climate commitments have emerged from those congregations. An eighth theme is to reevaluate your congregation's investments and divest your congregation's endowments, if you have any, from fossil fuel monies. The National United Church of Christ, as many of you know, became the first national body of any kind and the first religious body to vote to divest from fossil fuels. And now, something Bill McKibben and I never imagined, now investments worth over $12 trillion have purged their portfolios of ownership of fossil fuel stock. And today, you can go to any financial advisor who is worth his or her salt and say, you want a balanced portfolio that is free of fossil fuel stocks, and they'll say, oh, no problem. Whereas, if you had asked that question in 2014 or 2015, they would have said, what are you, out of your mind? That constitutes 30% of the Dow Jones, blah, 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 blah. All of that has changed. It has changed so much that in last year's annual report, Shell Oil reported in print, in their printed annual report, that the divestment movement constitutes a material threat to the business plan of Shell Oil Corporation. So here's a final theme of the new story God is calling us to create. Consider your congregation's collective capacity to leverage your assets and influence, right? Imagine if all houses of worship were to embrace the new story that God is calling the current generation to create. Imagine if half the members were to publicly pledge at least 10% of their time to work on climate change. Imagine if those members began to leverage their influence and their assets to promote policies and initiate actions that we have reviewed so far with the kind of urgency and on the kind of scale that science demands. Imagine if each one of you, if all of you, were to call in all your chits. This is something we think of very rarely. Imagine if you were to call in all of your chits and leverage all of your influence and connections and put it all on the line. We can actually beat climate change. But it demands of our generation something no generation has ever had to give. And that's essentially why we're gathered here today. So let me conclude by saying, as people of faith, God is calling us to face reality, to confess complicity, to grieve over losses and irreversible mistakes, and to imagine a different future, a future in which we give our lives to creating a new story in which diverse people unite in common cause, generate defiant and undefeatable hope, and persist in seeking reconciliation with all of creation. And by responding to God's call in these ways, we will be embracing God's dream. Thank you very much. So now it's an honor for me to be joined up here by a most distinguished panel. Maybe I'll offer a brief introduction of each one, and as I call out your name, if you would please come up here. Many of you are already familiar with the pastor of the congregation we are in, the Reverend Dr. Penny Nixon. Penny, you want to come up here? And so for you, she needs no introduction. She's a senior minister here and has led this church since 2007. Her tireless commitment to social justice and interfaith work is recognized throughout this county. Just one example of her many awards is that last year she was named Woman of the Year by the California Assembly District 22. And I had the pleasure of sitting next to Penny in dinner last night, and we just had the most wonderful conversation. And that, yeah, I could just go on and on. The Reverend Dr. You have a big fan club here. Appropriately so. The Reverend Dr. Eileen Altman. Eileen, come on up. She serves as associate pastor at First Congregational Church of Palo Alto, where she supports adult faith formation, pastoral care, and social justice and outreach ministry. Her work as a stay-at-home mom and then as a clinical psychologist working for healthier communities and low-income neighborhoods in Chicago prepared her well for her call to ordained ministry. It's great to have you on this panel, Eileen. Monsignor John, would you please come up? John, I don't want to mispronounce your last name. Please say it for me. Talasfor. Father John was ordained a priest in the Archdiocese of San Francisco in 1989. Since then, he has taught at St. Patrick's Seminary and served in various positions, most recently as pastor of St. Matthew Catholic Church in San Mateo. His interests include liturgy and interfaith relations. In 2010, His Holiness Pope Benedict XVI named him Papal Chamberlain with the title of Monsignor. Thanks for joining us. And the Reverend Canon Sally Bingham. Sally is among the most recognized national leaders in the environmental and climate movement. 25 years ago, she founded both the Regeneration Project and Interfaith Power and Light, a multi-faith national network that now includes over 10,000 congregations with affiliated programs in 35 states. Because of Sally, where are you, Sally? There you are. Because of Sally, thousands of religious people and hundreds and probably thousands of congregations have joined the climate movement. She's the recipient of numerous honorary degrees and recognitions by both Grist and Yes magazine. And Sally and I see each other every few years, and it's been a few years since we've seen each other. It's great to see you again and to be up here with you. Thank you. Let's check these mics. Check, check.
Check. Beautiful.
Yours is working? There we are. They're both working. Good. So you can pass that mic among the three of you, and we'll pass this mic among the two of us. And so for all of you to understand out there, I have some questions here, but I didn't have time to share these questions with my friends up here on stage. And so here's the plan. They're pretty open-ended. But my hope is that after I ask the question, that one of you will be a first respondent, and anybody else who wants to respond is fine. And I think we have, Gary, how much time do we have here? Till 11:30 though, is that the idea? So, we have plenty of time then. So in addition to these questions, if you guys want to go on a tear, I think that'll be fine. I think that'll be fine too, don't you? When you want to hear from what they have to say.
That's a little scary, but.
Oh, and then So after we do these questions, then we'll have time for Q&A. Okay, so you guys start thinking about questions that you're going to want to ask in addition to what we're going to be talking about up here. So here's the first. This is intended at least to be an open-ended question that'll give you an opportunity to really talk about whatever your sort of main engagement has been in regard to climate. Is there a specific project or a particular practice that your congregation is involved in that you think other congregations could benefit from engaging? And for some of you up here, you're not just the leader of a congregation, but you're involved with many congregations, and it's fine if you talk about, if you want to answer that question in any way you want. A particular practice or a specific project that other congregations could benefit from knowing. Who wants to start?
it's challenging. I am not a pastor of a congregation. I am the canon for the environment for the Diocese of California, which gives me a home at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco. And I have tried for years to get solar on the roof. And you all have seen the cathedral. It runs the whole block on California between Jones and Taylor Street. There is no place that would be more symbolic for using God's energy to power this cathedral. We haven't done it. There is a small segment of solar that is literally symbolic. Now, just so you know the challenges that we have gone through to get solar up there, because we have a whole committee that want to do this, we hear things like, well, we've never done that before. We are a historic building, so it has to have the approval of the entire neighborhood before it can happen. And then it costs money. And when I first proposed putting solar on the cathedral, I was told by the dean, who's not the dean now, but was then, that I couldn't ask anyone in the congregation for money because they were afraid that it would take away from annual contributions that congregants would give to the church anyway. So I'm not quite sure why I wanted to start with this big challenge, but it is hard. I mean, I think those of you who are lay people and you go to your clergy and say, why don't we have solar up there? The first thing you come up against is cost. And when you have the opportunity later today, talk with Lior, who is part of the California Interfaith Power and Light, and they have lots of resources for how nonprofit churches can put solar on the roof at no cost to the congregation. And there are ways that that's happening. 10 years ago, that was not the case. And but that is one thing your congregation can do. It serves as an example to the community. It shows people that the congregation is doing what you would like everybody in San Mateo County to do if you have solar up here.
Father John.
Well, first of all, I'm just grateful for this examination of conscience, which being invited to this whole event has brought up for me. We have little closet you go into for confessions, and I feel like I'm making one right here in front of the whole neighborhood. One of the confessions, Sally, is that a little wicked part of myself was what do I want to use? I let go of some jealousy because I was the rector at St. Mary's Cathedral in San Francisco at the same time that it was announced that you were going to be finding solar on Grace. And I had been struggling for the longest time to get solar on our property, which has this phenomenal southern exposure on the backside of the cathedral, where there's 2 residences and a high school. And my challenge was working with our archdiocesan structures and lawyers in regard to the threat that would place on our property tax situation. And I'm grateful to say that after now 15 years of my battling, that the Archdiocese of San Francisco is in fact sponsoring solar energy on our properties. Now, that was the great news when I invited them to St. Matthew's here in San Mateo with what I thought was beautiful exposure. They wanted to place it as structures in the parking lots that would have required knocking down, tearing down, uprooting life in some of these ancient trees. So it was like, of course, that's not going to happen. It's not going to be allowed. I'm certainly not going to allow it. But these are all of the things that a community needs to come together to look at and to understand how we can vision this in a way that's going to be optimal and prudent. And it is a great challenge, but it needs many minds and it needs groups that are coming together to work on this.
This will just take a minute, but for clarity, we do have a small amount of solar up on the north transept. It was donated by Pacific Gas and Electric. yeah. So that awful company that nobody likes anymore is actually pretty good on things like donations and solar.
I apologize. And I don't know if the technology and the financing have changed, but at the time I was in a position to contract with a company that was going to use our roof to generate this energy, and that it would completely underwrite our energy use in the cathedral. We have a school also, and that's another issue, is because schools use their energy at during the weekdays, which is a different rate, and the churches tend to, on evenings and weekends, be most busy, and so it really benefits a congregation much more than it does an educational institution.
Before the other two speak, I just want to offer an overview comment in relation to what we've just heard. This is such a helpful response to my question. This is hard. This transition that our world is undertaking must be made in a single generation, and it's really hard. So when you hear me talk about 100% of the people alive today need to devote maybe 10% of their time and energy to this, imagine if 100% of the people working in the Silicon Valley devoted 10% of their time and energy to this. Do you think we'd be hearing about problems in making these transitions up here? These are really smart people who are capable of earning lots and lots and lots of money and creating all kinds of opportunities to make all kinds of money. 10% of their time would easily make all of this transition happen. And many of them are people of faith. You know, when Barack Obama was in office, in relation to any number of things, like the Keystone Pipeline in particular, he told Bill McKibben and me and the other leaders of that, make me do this. And having served as the equivalent of a bishop of a denomination, essentially, I was in a position to say to my congregants, to my churches, you need to make me do this when I was facing the kind of difficult negotiations that the two of you are talking about. Penny or Eileen, you want to jump in here, please?
I'll speak. I'm actually quite proud of my congregation. Over the last 12 years, we've done some major climate action activities, including putting solar panels on our building about 4 years ago. Now, for us, the timing was right. We had to do a major re-roofing project, which required a major capital campaign. And it was actually, we'd already been having conversations for several years before that around wanting to make some changes in our energy structure in the building. And there were a few people who were really excited about putting solar on the roof, and they'd done a lot of research. And so when the time came to do that capital project, they had their research ready to prepare, ready to present to the capital committee, which was more concerned about how much are things going to cost. But in fact, I think the vision of putting solar on the church excited the congregation. They actually were much more excited about that than paying for a new roof, which of course is important, but the solar piece of it was really exciting. And we actually opted to buy the panels as opposed to doing the leasing option, because this committee had researched our options and thought this is actually better long term. You know, the great thing about churches is we're going to be around for decades and decades if we take care of our buildings well. And so for the congregation, it made more sense financially to just go ahead and buy them. So we accomplished that. And so there's sort of a new iteration of activism within our congregation. We sort of went from focusing on our own building to climate action. So we have this climate conversation group now that helped to bring you here, and really is actually trying to push the clergy to be even more active than we already have been, which is a great thing, because in our structure in the United Church of Christ, it's congregation members that really are the heart of what happens in the congregation. And so, I'm excited that this group is so engaged and is pushing us all to do more.
So I'm really happy that we have now an energy and environmental justice ministry, and many of them have been involved in making today happen. And I don't think we've done enough yet. We've done some greening of the building. We've talked about it, and I think we're starting a very deep and thoughtful process that will not be a long process, but we did this around becoming an immigrant welcoming congregation, and then we became a sanctuary church. And the thing that I know about this congregation is that we put our money where our mouth is. We try to walk our talk. And so so we had to have an acronym, because you can't have a committee unless you have an acronym. So the EEJ, the Energy and Environmental Justice Ministry, met with me and said, we want to do more. We've been talking for, 2 years now about putting solar panels on our parking lot because we wouldn't destroy any trees. And it seems more economically and just feasible in general because of the way our roofs are aligned. And so that's a project starting. But the EEJ came to me and said, we want you to do more, Penny. You're not doing enough. They said it a little more nicely than that. But you're not really, but you're not doing enough around climate. And we want you to do more. You're not preaching on it enough. You're not saying enough about it. And by the time that hour meeting was done, we had a whole plan. And I was, convicted, right, to do more and to make this the primary issue. And so we've come up with a great plan. So our whole Lenten series will be, that Easter will be about resurrection. I don't want to give too many things away because I want you to come hear it, but and experience it. But what I'd like to see us become, and I think there's great energy for this, I would like to see us vote as a congregation, because like you said, in the Congregational Church, that's where it happens. Vote to become a climate leader on the peninsula. And that would change us profoundly. And as we know from hearing Jim this morning and knowing ourselves, that it's only profound change that is going to make any difference at all. So I feel great that we're on the road. I'm going to come to your confession booth later and say, sorry I didn't get enough going beforehand, but we've got so many people with influence, passion, and brilliance in this community that I feel confident of where we're going to go. And I'm along for the ride to make that kind of difference. And I think it will become and is becoming in this moment our vocation.
One of the themes that I hear in everything that you've all said is that you have to keep at it. So I'm looking out at you folks to instruct you from what you've just heard. You just have to keep at it. You have to keep kind of knocking on the door. And pastors will tell you, as pastors, we have a lot to do. We have a lot to pay attention to. But each of these folks up here have given examples where persistence has, over time, paid off. And that's part of the job of the congregants, is to keep that persistence. Here's a different kind of a question. In a way, it's a more personal question, but it also may be a more universal question. Serving as clergy in the context of a climate crisis world, could you share one spiritual practice that you have embraced that allows you to continue to be a faithful witness in the context of a climate crisis world? One spiritual practice.
Well, this is something that struck me in a homily maybe about 12 years ago. And it was in the lectionary cycle that speaks about, it's the here I go being a Catholic priest, can't remember the scripture. But nonetheless, what evolved in the preparation and really my own conversion was this recognition of a sense of urgency that we have for our common home, for our environment, and the way in which our community, religious, spiritual, and both or neither, have this heightened sense of appreciation for clean air, for clean water, for an environment that is clean and life-giving, and to begin to reflect with the community about the spiritual environment in which we live and nurture one another and allow ourselves to be nurtured, and to become very much more mindful about the garbage that I let into my life and into my head and into my heart. And I've found this to be a most compelling image and sacramental symbol to share with people in the confessional and in adult education, formation, and in the classroom with junior high and children. So that I would say is probably the strongest spiritual thing that has really where I find the root of anything that's going to be authentic and fully integral.
Okay, I'll speak to it. It's very tempting to give in to despair. I will confess that. I have found myself feeling that way often as the dawning realization and the increasing realization of just how dire our circumstances are, and in a political context in which it doesn't seem obvious that we're going to make the kinds of policy changes that we need to make now in order to really get us to where we need to be. So it's very tempting to give into despair. And so spiritual practice, a couple of things that kind of move me from despair to hope. One is sort of daily getting out into nature and just reminding myself of the place that I live, the trees that are around me, the water that in the bay. I once a week I go to the ocean, and just to sort of remind myself of the beauty of this earth and the gift that God has given us to have air to breathe and water to drink, and just all the ways that life is nurtured. And then I would say the other thing that moves me to hope is to hang out with young people who are really activists, because it reminds me that I don't have to figure it out all myself. My generation doesn't have to figure it out. That there's this new generation of young people who are passionate and engaged and will show us the way. I mean, Greta is a great example of that, but even in my own community in Palo Alto, incredible activists. Those are mine.
I think that Eileen is absolutely correct about getting out into nature and enjoying what we still do have. The trees and the grass and the mountains. And where I live, I have a view of the Marin Headlands. And I walk every single day, and I try to remember to be grateful for what we still have, because I think that gratitude is a wonderful part of anybody's spiritual life. I also believe that this entire issue, that the climate issue, is a spiritual issue. And I say that because how we respond to this crisis is indicative of our relationship with God, with nature, and with our neighbors. So that is how, I spend a good deal of time in prayer, asking God to help me be kinder and gentler with people who don't understand the climate crisis, because I have a tendency to just say, "You stupid idiot." You know? I mean, how can you not know? I mean, how can you not believe the science? And that just doesn't work with people. It only makes them go. I found this out from the pulpit. The first time I gave a sermon on climate change, you cannot hit people over the head with, "This is a problem, it's your fault, and you need to do something about it and get out of that big car." And I found out over time that if I were simply to say, God put Adam in the garden to till it and to keep it. We are the gardeners of this planet, and we need to do a good job with that. And if you start there, people will say, well, of course. But if you hit them over the head with the climate change is a problem and you're part of the problem, it just doesn't work. So I have spent years asking myself to be kinder and gentler to the people who are, I don't want to say on the other side, but who aren't yet convinced that this is a problem and that it is something we can solve. I also remind myself that we can solve this problem. It's as soon as we have a critical mass who care about it, and I have to just relate to what's here today. When I gave a talk on religion and climate 15 years ago, we'd be lucky if there were 5 or 10 people out there. And look at all the folks who are now realizing this is a spiritual, moral issue. We can make a difference. You wouldn't be here if you didn't believe that we could make a difference. I think the faith voice, that kind of moral authority that comes from the church in this conversation about solutions, is maybe going to be the thing that tips the iceberg, if there are any icebergs left.
That was good.
Tip the iceberg, that's a new metaphor, I think. So I don't consider myself Trinitarian very often, but if I did, it would be God, Jesus, and Mary Oliver. And so I'd say part of my spiritual practice is reading Mary Oliver, because what I try to do each day is to be very intentional about how that we are all connected, and that I do not and cannot live a neutral life. None of my actions are neutral. They move the needle one way or the other, whether that's by what I eat or by how I pray or by my thoughts. And so I also try to be in nature every single day. I spend time with my dog every day because she reminds me that that I'm connected. I'm connected to her. I'm connected to all sentient beings. I'm connected to the earth. And for me, this reflecting on this notion, that, I think Christian theology over the millennia have talked about God being in the world. And I don't see it that way anymore. I think of the world being in God, that everything is animated with divine presence. For me, a spiritual practice is to recognize that in the smallest of details in my life. And in that same way, to never, as Eileen said, to never give in to the luxury of despair, because we don't have that luxury. And to believe that what I do matters. And I believe that, and I preach that, and I think for me that is probably fundamental to my spiritual practice. And that before I can ever, start saying this, I have to look here, to my own life, to my own integrity, to my own being in alignment with the things that I say are most important and the changes that I see that need to be made. And so looking in that spiritual mirror on a consistent basis is probably my most important spiritual practice, and reading Mary Oliver.
Did she mention Mary Oliver?
Because she gets that animation of life in all things and that attention to detail in the smallest beings. It's just beautiful.
So I want to make an observation about what we've just heard. I just think I think of how few times in the past 20 years of my own work on climate change have I been treated to the kind of testimony we just heard. And it's reminding me, like, we don't often, like, invite people to talk about their spiritual practices in relation to, in this case, what seems to be an impossible challenge. It's not an impossible challenge, as many of you cited. My heart resonated with several things that each of you said. And my guess is that's true for many of you out there. And it's like we need to be reminded, actually, how spiritually equipped we already are. And we need to be reminded of how much attention we're already paying just to get us through the challenges of this particular day, because we aren't turning off from the truths and the scientific facts. And that creates an existential challenge to getting through the day. And so my guess is that, there's 100 people here, and that all of you are processing, oh yeah, I do something, I make myself aware of my gratitude every single day, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We need to keep doing that, and this is my assignment for you, and we need to go back to our respective congregations and create opportunities for this kind of sharing. Because as laterally as we open our hearts to each other in matters that often remain private, what we do is we bolster each other for the courage these times demand, right? It's really, really true. I just want to thank you all for opening up on that. So see if this is an easier question, then I have a harder question after this. For those in our audience who represent a congregation which has not yet engaged the climate crisis, how would you encourage them to begin?
I don't want to dominate or talk too much, okay? We started at the cathedral and also in other Episcopal churches around the diocese with 2 or 3 people. If you're here and you're part of a congregation that's not involved in anything to do with climate, find somebody else in the congregation who is. And 2 of you sit down and start talking about it. Or start a committee that says, we're going to be the environmental stewardship committee of our congregation. And you'll be amazed if you stand up during the announcements and say, we're forming a committee on environmental stewardship, who wants to join? And you'd be surprised how many people will join you. The first thing is to have that small group of people who care. Then you invite your rector to come and sit down with you and say, this is something we really care about. Could you please do some sermons on creation care? And it'll kind of take off on its own. And some people will say, well, let's put solar on. Somebody else might say, let's rip up the parking lot and put in a garden. Or someone else will say, look, let's do Sunday school around Earth Day and bring the children in. And there are amazing ideas in the minds of the people in the congregation. The whole point is to get the conversation started.
Any other comments?
I would say the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, from my own experience just today, I would really urge you to begin humbly. That this is very humbling for me, quite frankly, when I recognize the passion with which I hold this urgency, what I have done, and mindful of what I've failed to do. And I'm grateful that, a few years ago, the Archdiocese did have events to encourage kind of green teams in parishes, and one of the participants from St. Matthew's is here again today, and we have a new parishioner who participated last year in the Vatican at the Conference for Laudato Si, the papal encyclical, who's new to our community, and as they're both here today, I'm hoping that there's a committee forming there now. And is it Owen from your community here? Who did I speak to? Wait, I've got his name right here. Warren. I just spoke to Warren about your committee starting today, and we'll be in touch just to see how that's going and how we can start anew. So really, it's with humility that I sit up here as someone. I did work at St. Mary's Cathedral with, what is it? What do we call it now? Faith and light? Interfaith, power and light. It's just simply a matter of that awareness and really calling your pastor to it, or having the neighboring pastor call you to sit up on a stage and talk about these things very humbly. So thank you, Penny.
I just want to build on what Father John just said. In the sort of lateral connection from congregation to congregation, if you have a congregation that's kind of really into it, and you're in a congregation that isn't, and you can kind of, knock on the leadership of your congregation's door and say, they're doing it next door, that it matters. It really matters. It really does. Okay, please go ahead. Go ahead.
Related to that, I just want to say, in the Palo Alto area, we have a group called Peninsula Interfaith Climate Action. Debbie Meitels has organized that, and she's sitting right out there. And it's a group. It's congregations in that part of the peninsula who meet regularly and sort of trade notes about what's your congregation doing and how can we act together to bring potential speakers or to engage with 350.org. So it's been a really exciting addition to what our own local congregation does to collaborate with other congregations. Thank you for organizing us, Debbie.
And let me build on what Eileen just said. Many of you out there, you're a member of a congregation, and you would never think to affiliate with a secular organization like 350.org. And I'm here to say those affiliations are happening all over the country. Sierra Club chapters and local congregations, 350.org and local congregations, Sunrise Movement chapters and local congregations. These things are happening all over the country, and that's because more and more people, now this would be a separate gathering, and I could go on this with as much passion as I have about climate change. That's because people are beginning to realize that religion has at least as much to do with values as it does to do with beliefs. So Brian McLaren, if you're interested, has a book out. It's been out for about 3 years now called Spiritual Migration. And the point of the book is to say that religion, while for 2,000 years was focused on agreement in beliefs, it is now migrating to recognizing that it's about agreement in values. And the application of that sort of big picture concept to what we're talking about here is that everybody in this room shares values with people in 350.org, with the Sunrise Movement, with the Sierra Club. And yet very few churches would think, well, we can't affiliate with them. They're not religious organizations. Wrong. That you don't need to have that as a barrier anymore. So thank you for that comment. So here's a comment that I just think is essential. We'll all have to take a deep breath before we answer it. I'd like you to comment on what people should do with their grief over creation's demise. Is worship a context in which grief can be shared? Do you think that the public expression of grief amplifies the urgency of the crisis? How can houses of worship become safe enough places for climate grief to be expressed and embraced?
I don't have a real answer for that, and I'm going to take this in a little different direction. I would not recommend focusing on grief. You talked earlier, Jim, about hope. The way we maintain hope, which would keep us from the despair and the grief, is to be doing something ourselves. And I heard, I don't know who coined this, but the person that talked about the difference between hope and optimism. Optimism is thinking that everything's going to turn out all right in the end. But hope is a verb with your sleeves rolled up. And if you're doing something to help solve this problem, you are maintaining hope within yourself that I hope would not let you fall into grief. I mean, I have friends who are not part of any religious community who are in despair right now over the administration, over all the stuff that's gone on in the last couple of weeks in our country, and where climate and the destruction of flora, fauna, animals that are happening around the world has really taken them down. And they will talk about despair. But they're not part of a religious community where they have the hope that comes with the hope of the resurrection. And not to keep it Christian, because it isn't, but I think if you believe in the power of the human spirit, if you believe that we as American citizens can solve serious problems, which we have done in the past, we can do this. But we won't do it unless each one of us does something that will help solve this problem. And you all know what those things are. Do one thing every day. Or maybe it's the same thing every day. Maybe you have an electric car and you go past the gas station and you can say, well, at least I'm not using gas. Or, there are all these different things that we can do, and a lot of them have been mentioned this morning. But as long as you're doing something, you really shouldn't fall into grief and despair. I don't think, but I'm eternally optimistic and a very optimistic person by nature. So I'm not in despair. I mean, maybe I should be, but right now I feel that we can solve this problem. The technology's there. We just need a critical mass to make it happen.
I think there's always a place for lament, and I don't think staying in grief is helpful. I think acknowledging grief, acknowledging what is and facing that head on is probably the most important thing we can do. What actually is, because as human beings, we don't we want to deny our own death. So we're not going to face the death of the planet very easily, right? So really being deeply realistic, what is in this moment, and being able to name that, for me, is really important. And yeah, that's going to bring some grief, but we can't stay there. We have to embrace resiliency and move on. And make the changes, but I think we can only make the changes. I don't think the changes will come by grieving. I think the changes that we are willing to make will only come by facing reality head on, and then making choices about what we're going to do, and having imagination with how something could be. And I do think that there's a way that's helpful to talk about hope. Sally, I'm not quite on the same page as you. I think there's a way that is helpful to talk about hope, but I think in other times it's almost not helpful to talk about hope. I don't think the younger generations are all that big on hope right now. That's the truth. That's what is. And I have younger folks say to me, don't tell me to be hopeful. Don't ask me to have hope. I don't know that we can change this around. That doesn't mean that I'm not going to give myself to it. But there is a deep concept that we must work and keep going, whether we have hope or not. And I know that that's not maybe the Christian message that I'm supposed to give, but I think it's realistic. That doesn't mean to sink into despair, but even if we don't see hope, we still have to act because it is the right thing to do.
But if you're acting, you can have hope. Do you think that Greta would be out making these speeches if she didn't have hope that it was going to make a difference?
That would be an interesting question to ask her.
Yeah, I think the kids that are not going to school on Fridays, I think all of the protests and marches that we're having are because people do have hope, or they wouldn't be protesting. If you didn't have any hope, you'd ride your bicycle out to the Golden Gate Bridge and jump right off.
Well, in a sense, I hope to. I'm going to have to leave about noon because I have a funeral at 1, but, and I'm always, when I hear of grief, think of St. Paul to the Thessalonians, that we not grieve like those who have no hope. He doesn't say don't grieve, but we're people who grieve with hope. And I do agree with both of you sincerely. And when you asked the question, I thought immediately of two things. First of all, the constant rhythm of hope in, again, Pope Francis' encyclical Laudato Si. Constantly, he speaks with this hope. Each time when you just think you're going to get like just downtrodden by all of this, and it's always based on our capacity as human beings and this expanding consciousness of our universe and of our capacity. And I think of my own experience in 12-step recovery and working in 12-step spirituality, of really breaking it down to something that I can do. And even if I can't see something that I can do or don't want to do what I see in front of me, to pray for the willingness to do it. And to really pray for, as a disciple, as a Christian, intentional disciple, wanting to be more intentional about things like this, to pray for a conversion, because this really is about a conversion, an interior conversion that has to do with letting go of the sense of what must I do, to really coming from a place of what can I do, and doing it and finding a way to do it in a measure that I can.
We haven't created space for public expressions of grief in our congregation, but I will just say, as a pastor, that I am aware that the people in my congregation who are the most active on climate issues come at it because of grief that they feel about the world that their grandchildren will have or their children will have. So their activism comes from that grief, and I'm aware of that as the pastor, but we don't necessarily create rituals around that. That's where the activism comes from. Yeah.
So I just want to add two things in regard to what you just said. Because I get around to so many different congregations, I have been privileged to be part of a couple of congregations that have created rituals around grief as a means to an end, to your point, Sally, as a means to an end. And the other thing about young people and hope, I think you're exactly right. And what I'll be saying in my sermon tomorrow at Palo Alto, if any of you want to come, but I'm not trying to steal people from this congregation. What I'll be saying there is that young people understand hope not as optimism whatsoever, no connection to optimism. Young people understand hope as engagement.
Yeah, there you go.
And that's not in contradiction to the New Testament, which you wonderfully quoted there. That was good. That was a good job. And we would do well, everybody in this room would do well, and certainly I have done well as a spiritual discipline myself, to keep rehearsing, hope. Hope is about engagement. Roll up your sleeves and get about the business of hope. Hello. All right, so here's the final question. Oh, did somebody want to say something else? Yeah, please, go ahead.
Just one more word on hope. Can I just say that? So I can totally live, and that's where I'm at, with hope as engagement. So I don't want anybody to think I'm completely hopeless. I don't feel that way most days. But hope as engagement. And I learned that in the years where I was ministering with people dying of AIDS, multiple people every week, and the grief, but hope was engagement. You got up, you embraced life, you sat with those who were dying. And Jim, you said it today, that the people who do the least harm are suffering the most. And I do wonder, I just feel like I have to say this, I do wonder if it is almost a privilege to say we can have hope. Because I think that the poorest around the world I think it's a bit of a privilege sometimes to say that we have hope, because I think that there are some pretty hopeless situations that people are living in right now across the world that it's not going to get better. And I think for me, that's part of what is and facing the reality.
And just to build on what you just said, because I totally agree with what you said, one of the things that's most moving for me in relation to climate activism is that we happen to live in a time when we have YouTube and we can actually make a connection with somebody living under those circumstances, and particularly with young people living under those circumstances, who then testify to their engagement. You know, they're standing outside with millions of other young people with a protest sign. There was a kid in Leningrad who was put in jail for his Fridays for the Future protest. He was 17 years old, and he was in jail for 21 days because he held a sign on a Friday in solidarity with other 17-year-olds around the world. And to see his expression, he testified that he had no hope. And he was out there with his sign, which told me he had engagement, which I, at least in the context of this conversation, want to connect deeply with hope. Gary. Okay, good. Yes.
Okay. Do we have many questions? Good. I'm going to go over to Mary Rose. She asked me first.
Thank you. I want to be respectful to the Father's time. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm a fairly new Catholic, and I'm also started a Laudato Si circle at my parish. It's a fairly new ministry, just started back in September, and we meet together to pray, reflect, and act, and it's incredible. Boy, have I heard grief. And we show up for each other, and out of that grief comes, what can we do? It spurs people on to do something. And we have a priest also at our parish that says, when you get together and show up for each other, you're sharing your gifts. That's when Christ walks among you. And we really feel that powerfully. So my question for you, Father, one of the first actions our group took was to write a letter to Archbishop Corleone, because we recognized the powerful speech he gave at St. Anne's in 2016, and we want to join our voices with him, and we want to see our priests taking more leadership and preaching it in the homilies, creation care. So little by little, we're making progress at our parish, and our priests are very open to the homily helps from the Catholic Climate Covenant, from the Global Catholic Climate Movement. There's a couple of great organizations. So I guess my question to you is, how do I reach Archbishop Corleone? I need help.
My backpack's right there, and his phone number is in.
Awesome.
Well, that's a great question. I would be really very frank and to say to continue to reach out as you have, to try to work with other parishes where there's a circle of Laudato Si. I don't know if you've seen that, for instance, St. Rita's having a big conference coming up with some pretty impressive speakers, and that really is the way to get to him. There's a renewed commitment to dialogue between the Archbishop and the priests of the Archdiocese through deanery work and things of those sorts. So it is a need from someone who has found himself kind of swamped administratively, but to come forward in a really supportive way of what we can do to assist you precisely as you said. And I'd love to talk to you about it some more to be helpful in that regard.
Thank you. Can't wait to talk more.
Thanks.
Okay, additional questions?
Hey, good morning. My name is Dave, and I work for a Christian environmental nonprofit called Plant with Purpose, and I just have a quick observation and then a question. The observation is you talk about the people that are affected the most by climate change have the least to do with it. We work with 40,000 subsistence farmers around the world, and honestly, a lot of the deforestation that's happened in the areas that they're living are caused by them. And it's not to rag on them. They have no choice but to cut down the trees that are around them to get fuel to feed their families. So they can be part of the solution to all of this. It's not just an American problem. There are 1 billion people in the world that live in extreme poverty every day. Half of those are subsistence farmers. So if we can introduce solutions to those farmers that plant trees, it can have a huge impact on the environment around the world. And to your point about hope, I have met people who have planted trees, reforested their area, improved their crop yields, increase income, and they are able to take care of their families. And the stories of hope that come from those people who have, by their own hands, have taken care of their families, it's incredible to see. So there is hope around the world. I just want to reassure you that that is happening. So my question is, we haven't talked about trees in particular. We've touched on creation care, but behind you is a tree. And trees are incredible sources of justice, and they restore soil, and they cool the air, and they replenish water systems. So my question to you is, what have you thought about reforestation, not only in the Bay Area and in America, but internationally, things that you could do to partner? If you want to partner with our organization, this isn't an ad, but we are an incredible organization. Have you thought about more tree planting? And because it can reduce perhaps 30% of the carbon that's being released in the atmosphere, and it's a pretty simple and inexpensive solution. Thank you.
I'm sure that my colleagues up here have thought about trees. Trees are a carbon sink, and we obviously need them. We actually have a program called Carbon Covenant, which you can find on, if you go to Google, California Interfaith Power and Light has a place where you can click on Carbon Covenant, and we have partnered with a Presbyterian denomination in Kilimanjaro, and they're putting 1 million trees back on the mountainsides there, and we've got an arrangement where it's a little like Habitat for Humanity, where if you've got someone you need to give a gift to, but they have everything they need, you can give 100 trees and they'll go to replant Kilimanjaro. We've also, it's a 4 covenant partnership with, besides the Presbyterian Church, there's some Buddhists in Cambodia who have partnered with us, and they are ordaining their trees because an ordained tree with an orange ribbon around it will not be cut down. And we have this partnership with them, but look at Carbon Covenant, or Leo, what's it called? Is it CO2 Covenant? Carbon Covenant on search, we'll find it. And people can give to the reforestation in those 4 different areas in the developing world. But also, just what you've said is so important. I have just joined a board called the Pacific Forest Trust, and it's a nonprofit that is working on management and reforestation all up and down the West Coast. So I'm well aware that trees are important.
There's a book by Matthew Sleeth. I forget the title of it. Reforesting Faith. Matthew Sleeth and I are friends. This is a terrific book. It's written from a conservative Christian point of view, but it's all in on climate change stuff. Also, something I quote in every sermon I preach, I'll be saying it tomorrow, is that in a 24-hour period, Ethiopians planted 350 million trees.
Oh.
You brought up Matthew's book. Matthew's also a friend of mine, and in his book, he says, and I like to claim this for myself, but it really came from Matthew Sleeth. He said, an example of how much God loves trees. trees get a ring every year on their birthday.
Oh. Okay, let's take the next question.
My name's Steve. I'm with Eileen's church in Palo Alto. I have a very practical a suggestion or a question to you whether this would work, and that is to address the problem, the decades-long problem that churches have faced all over the world is the decreasing congregations that they all face. To some extent, you guys are all politicians. You need to get votes of people to walk into your churches Sunday morning. And so you need to speak a language that they understand and relate to and are inspired by. And I'm thinking that with all the young people out there who are engaged in what we're talking about today, you could attract a lot of people from our towns to come to church if you move your message more away from the beliefs of the 2,000-year beliefs to the values that Jim is talking about. And I know in Palo Alto we have a big banner on the front of the church. What does it say? Save our world, with the blue globe showing, save our world's, God's earth for our children. And so everyone knows where we stand as they drive by on Embarcadero Road. But if you guys can reach out a little more with this message, I wonder if we would increase our congregation. And especially this would be important for any churches that are suffering from a low population, which in Palo Alto we're fortunate not to have that problem. Thanks.
Ralph?
Thank you, Gary. I'm with 350 Silicon Valley, and we've been, we believe that only a mass uprising will break the logjam and the trance that we're all in over climate. And we have been trying everything for the last few years to get more people to do civil disobedience. And I was wondering if you all have any thoughts on how we can get your churches and other churches that are less awake than you to bring more people to civil disobedience. Thank you.
So my comment on that is 2 years ago I retired from being a denominational head for over 350 churches in the United Church of Christ of Massachusetts. And during that period of time of 12 years of leadership, I was arrested numerous times, including twice in the governor's office. And what that did was it set a leadership signal to the other 900 clergy in Massachusetts. It's okay to be arrested. And I've been using this expression, make civil disobedience, a normative expression of Christian discipleship for 20 years. Normative means normal, to your point, right? And I couldn't agree with you more. I think we are going to beat this challenge. And second, somewhere, and I hope it happens sooner rather than later, people with values and people of faith will realize, well, of course I'm willing to get arrested. Are you kidding? I love my children. And that's the only explanation that's needed. So I think setting an example, having people that are in positions of privilege or leadership, setting an example around civil disobedience, in my mind, is the most effective way. I've talked with a couple of Congress people about civil disobedience in Congress, and you might remember that John Lewis and, I'm forgetting her name, from Massachusetts, they essentially committed civil disobedience in the halls of Congress. And that was, by my recollection and by the research I've done, the first time in the history of the United States that was done. But the newspapers didn't cover it that way. The newspapers didn't lift it up as saying, my God, civil disobedience in the nation's capital. I couldn't agree with you more. Does anyone else want to add something to that? Yeah, okay, another question.
Okay. These have been great comments and questions, but unfortunately we have time for just one more. Warren?
I'm a member of the Congregational Church here. I hope I'm eloquent enough to ask this question properly. The Christian faith in the Bible is one in which it says humans have domination over the earth. And I think part of the message that will save the earth is to treat, as the Native Americans have, our sisters, the eagles, our brothers, the bears, etc. Because we as a species are destroying other species. And we can, because they were sentient beings, but there are others, including trees, have a responsibility to be more egalitarian with other animals and other flora and fauna on Earth. Just as a comment. Thank you.
Okay. One quick question.
I've been talking to some pastors and trying to figure out how to get more of them engaged. And I was recently speaking to Mark Scandrette, who's a San Francisco-based minister and writer. And he mentioned that he thinks one of the reasons pastors are reticent to talk about climate change from the pulpit is because they're used to talking about what they know, being authorities, and that the body of knowledge is so big, it's hard to get your arms around it. I would just like to know from some of you working ministers, is that a factor, and how big of a factor is it, and how do we overcome it?
That's very real. I know when we first started, we were going around to Episcopal churches asking the clergy to talk about climate, and they're afraid to do it because they're not experts. They don't want to end up in coffee hour with a parishioner saying, well, you said 425 parts per million, but that's not really right. And the clergy that are head of a congregation have so many issues to deal with. I mean, they have death and illness and marriages and baptisms and all the issues that their parishioners have. And then we go in and we say, we want you to talk about climate change. So one of the reasons that I've been all over the country talking about climate change is because the in-house rector didn't want to do it. And they can say, if they're also worried that they might have deniers. They may have people who just don't think it's an issue and don't believe in the science, and they don't want to lose them as parishioners by being labeled, oh, this congregation has gotten too progressive for me, or it's too liberal. So what would happen in my case is when I was leaving, if the congregation liked it, the rector would say, yeah, isn't that great, and then talk about it him or herself later. If they didn't like it, we could say, well, she's from California. She's just a wacky person from California. So they could embrace it if it was received well, and they could dismiss it if it wasn't. But it is hard for them unless they're already personally involved with climate. And I would imagine that John could give a pretty good sermon on or homily on climate, and you too. And I can. But a lot of rectors don't want to go down that path. It's new. It's often seen as a political issue, which is really too bad because it's not. It's a spiritual, moral issue. So that's enough. But it is hard for them. What they told you is probably true.
Thank you. Speaking from the Catholic perspective, I'm finding that the whole study and discussion of sacraments is evolving and really emerging as a conversation point for this whole topic and for this reality. And that is a place where, for those liturgical churches that celebrate with sacraments and with natural elements in the liturgy above, as well as all the churches that speak from the Bible with all of these images. I mean, I did in my graduate work, my first assignment was to look up and find everywhere in the Bible and in Catholic liturgical tradition the word wood, and in the Latin, lignum, which means tree and wood, and to simply present some comprehensive theological statement about what God is communicating to us in tree wood, and that lends itself to some great homilies in terms of trees and forestation, as well as Adam and Eve and Calvary, and Tree of Life and Revelation. But those are things too. Is find your traditions, strong points here and find your own personal strong points of experience in study and integrate. That's really, again, what is going to be authentic in any conversion and solution for us, is that this is integrated in every dimension of our lives, our minds, and our thoughts. And where do you connect? That's the place you speak from. Is that helpful?
Okay, on that note, please join me in thanking the panel.